The wind, a persistent winter guest in the northern domain of Akita, carried the scent of frozen earth and distant wood smoke. It bit at Kira's exposed cheeks as she knelt by the frozen stream. Her chapped fingers fumbling with the stiff, icy fibers of wild hemp she would gathered. Another decree, she thought, her mind a colder place than the landscape. More hunger. The lords in their drafty castles ate, the crows circling overhead would find their share, and the villagers. The villagers would starve quietly, as was their station. This was the Kyoho era, the 17th year of Lord Shogun Yashimun's reign, a time of reforms meant to restore order, but which, in these remote lands of Japan, often felt like just another tightening of the noose. Kira was 20, though the harshness of her life had etched lines of premature wisdom around her observant, dark eyes. Those eyes, usually downcast in the presence of even the lowest-ranking samurai, missed little. Now, they scanned the bleak horizon, half expecting the glint of steel or the flutter of a banner that would signal the arrival of the new inspector. News had traveled on the wind, as it always did, faster than any official messenger, a man named Aoki, known for his unwavering adherence to the shogun's will, was coming to oversee the implementation of the latest tax levies. Fear, a familiar companion in Kira's village of Ogawa, had sharpened its claws. A sudden memory, sharp as a shard of ice, pierced through her focus. Her father, his strong carpenter's hands gentle as he carved a wooden toy for her younger brother, Kenji. Then, the other memory, those same hands, bloodied and broken, after he had been accused of a minor infraction by a passing samurai official, a bow not deep enough, a look held too long. The official's pride, easily wounded, had demanded a swift, brutal lesson. Her father had never walked properly again, his spirit dimming until he finally succumbed to a fever. The following winter. That was 5 years ago, but the injustice of it still burned in Kira's chest, a cold, hard knot of resentment. It was the wellspring of her quiet skepticism. Her profound distrust of the power wielded so arbitrarily by the samurai class. She secured the hemp, her movements economical, born of a lifetime of making every effort count. Her slender frame held a deceptive strength, her hands calloused from labor that belied her youth. Her dark hair, usually tied back in a simple knot, had a few rebellious wisps framing her face, a subtle defiance against the perfect control expected of women, even peasant women. A small, faded scar near her temple, a memento from a childhood fall into a rocky gully, throbbed faintly in the cold. The village headman, old Ichiro, had been even more subdued than usual these past few days, his face a mask of worry. The previous year's harvest had been meager. The early frosts taking their toll. The new taxes would push many families, Kira's included, to the brink. Her mother, her health fragile since her husband's decline, relied on Kira for everything. And Kenji, now 10, was a growing boy with an appetite that seemed to mock their dwindling supplies of dried daikon and millet. Kira-san, a voice, thin and reedy, called her name. It was Sumiko, a neighboring woman whose husband was often ill, her face pinched with anxiety. "Have you heard? The inspector's retinue was sighted near the Mikuni Pass. They will be here by midday, they say." Kira nodded, her expression carefully neutral, though her heart quickened. "The wind carries many tales, Sumiko-san. We will know when they arrive." But inside, the cold knot tightened. Another lord, another decree. And the peasants, as always, would bear the weight. The very air seemed to crackle with a brittle tension, the silence of the snow-covered fields amplifying the unease that had settled over Ogawa. Like a shroud. The arrival of Inspector Aoki was less a grand entrance and more a chilling imposition, a formal descent upon their meager existence. He rode a lean, dark horse, its breath pluming in the frigid air, his posture ramrod straight, his kamishimo of dark, unadorned silk functional but of impeccably high quality. His face was ascetic, dominated by cold, calculating eyes that seemed to absorb everything and reflect nothing. Like polished stones at the bottom of a winter river. A thin, cruel smile, if it could be called that, touched his lips as he surveyed the bowing villagers, but it never reached his eyes. He was flanked by a handful of stern-faced samurai. Their swords, katana and wakizashi, worn with an air of practiced authority that broadcasted their status. Among them, slightly to the rear, rode a younger samurai. Haruto, whose expression was less severe, perhaps even holding a hint of disciplined curiosity as he observed the scene, his own gaze lingering for a moment on the stark poverty of the village. Aoki dismounted with a precise, economical movement, handing the reins to a subordinate without a glance. He did not waste breath on pleasantries. His voice, when he spoke, was as sharp and cold as the winter wind slicing down from the O mountains. I am Inspector Aoki Eiji, here by the authority of Lord Date Yoshimura of Sendai, to ensure the shogun's Kyoho reforms are implemented fully and without obstruction in this domain. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the villagers, each individual seemingly catalogued and dismissed. The new tax levies are not suggestions. They are law. Compliance is expected. Evasion will be met with the full severity of that law. Let there be no misunderstanding. The final words were delivered with a quiet emphasis that brooked no argument. Kira, her head bowed with the others, the rough fabric of her clothing scratching her neck, felt a tremor of the old fear, the old rage. This man, with his perfectly creased hakama and his pronouncements of unbending law, was the system that had crushed her father. He was the polished surface of a brutal, unyielding power. She risked a fleeting glance upwards, meeting Haruto's eyes for a split second before quickly looking down. In that brief contact, she saw not coldness, but something less defined, perhaps the unease of a young man in a role he had not yet fully inhabited, a flicker of something almost human. The inspector's men began their work immediately, their presence casting a pall over Ogawa. They moved through the village with an air of entitlement, their inquiries sharp, their demands unwavering. The headman, Ichiro, aged visibly with each passing hour, caught between the inspector's unyielding demands and the villagers' desperate pleas, his face a mask of impotent distress. The rhythmic clack of their wooden sandals on the frozen ground became a sound of dread. Kira focused on her tasks, gathering firewood, which was becoming scarcer as the winter deepened. Tending to her mother's persistent cough with a brew of horehound and ginger root she would learn from old Granny Chio before she passed into the embrace of the ancestors. Ensuring Kenji had at least a thin gruel of millet and wild greens to fill his stomach. She moved through her days with a practiced quietness. Her observations her only weapon, her resilience her only shield. She noted the way Aoki's men inventoried even the smallest tools, the way their eyes lingered on any stored food. The subtle hierarchy among them. One afternoon, while gathering herbs in the sparse woods bordering the village, where the pines stood like somber sentinels against the gray sky, she encountered Haruto. He was alone, seemingly sketching the gnarled branches of an ancient, snow-dusted pine tree in a small, leather-bound notebook. He looked up, startled, as she approached, her soft-soled straw zori making little sound on the pine needles. "Forgive my intrusion, Samurai-sama," Kira said, bowing low, her hands clutching a small basket of withered wintergreen. Haruto's initial surprise gave way to a polite, if slightly awkward, nod. "No intrusion. I was merely observing the structure of the branches." He seemed younger up close, his face less stern than when he was in Aoki's presence. His features were fine, his hands, though capable of wielding a sword, looked more suited to the delicate brushwork he was engaged in. "You are from the village?" "Yes, Samurai-sama. Kira is my name." "Kira-san." He tested the name, a slight frown of concentration on his face. You gather herbs. For my mother's cough, Samurai-sama. The winter air is harsh in Akita. He nodded, his gaze returning to his notebook. There was an uncomfortable silence, filled only by the whisper of the wind in the pines. Kira sensed he was different from the others in Aoki's retinue, less hardened, perhaps. But he was still samurai. The gulf between them, peasant and warrior, was as wide and deep as the Mogami River. The inspector's work. It is difficult for the village, Kira found herself saying, the words escaping before she could stop them. It was a risk, a small, almost imperceptible test. A seed of dissent cast into barren ground. Haruto's hand stilled over his sketch. He did not look at her. Inspector Aoki is a man of singular purpose. He believes deeply in the shogun's reforms, that they are for the ultimate stability of the realm. Reforms can be heavy burdens for those who must carry them, Samurai-sama, Kira said softly, her eyes on the frozen ground. Stability for the realm can mean starvation for a village. He finally looked at her, his expression unreadable, a carefully constructed samurai mask. The law must be upheld, for the good of all. It is the foundation of peace. It sounded like a line he had been taught, one he was perhaps trying to convince himself of, a tenet from the Confucian texts drilled into young samurai. Before Kira could respond, or regret her boldness, he closed his notebook with a decisive snap. I must return. My duties await. He offered a curt nod and strode away, his figure disappearing quickly among the trees. Leaving Kira with a strange mix of apprehension and a dawning, dangerous flicker of something akin to hope. Not hope in him, precisely, but hope that not all within the samurai class were cut from the same unyielding, indifferent cloth as Inspector Aoki. It was a foolish thought. She chided herself, one that could lead to nothing but trouble. Survival lay in invisibility, not in engaging the attention of their overlords. The days that followed saw Aoki's grip tighten inexorably. He moved his base of operations from the main domain town of Kubota to a commandeered section of the local magistrates' modest compound near Ogawa, effectively placing the village under direct, unblinking surveillance. His men were everywhere, their presence a constant reminder of his authority. He scrutinized the village's meager rice stores, cross-referenced tax records Ichiro had painstakingly maintained for years, records written with a brush that trembled more with each passing day, and summoned villagers for questioning at all hours, their interrogations often lasting late into the night, the chilling sound of Aoki's sharp voice carrying on the wind. The air in Ogawa grew thick with unspoken fear. Whispers replaced conversations. Smiles became strained and rare, like winter sunlight. The usual sounds of village life, children's laughter, the rhythmic thud of a mallet hulling rice, the cheerful banter of women at the well, were muted, replaced by an oppressive quiet. Kira continued her routines, her outward demeanor one of quiet compliance. Inside, however, a cold anger simmered, a banked fire fanned by each new indignity. She saw the fear in her mother's eyes deepen, the way Kenji now played in hushed tones near their small, smoky hearth, his childish exuberance systematically muted. She saw neighbors share their dwindling rations of millet and pickled vegetables, their solidarity a fragile shield against the inspector's chilling efficiency. One evening, returning from the woods with a small bundle of edible roots, the forest floor offering little else in the dead of winter, she saw old Manzo, a farmer known for his stubborn pride and a voice that once boomed at village festivals, being dragged from his hut by two of Aoki's grim-faced men. Manzo's wife wailed, a raw, animal sound of despair, his children clung to her, their faces streaked with tears and dirt. The charge, Kira later learned from Sumiko's hushed whispers, was suspicion of hoarding rice, a handful of measures, barely enough for a few days, found hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his storeroom, rice Manzo had likely saved for his granddaughter's upcoming, now likely cancelled, wedding. An example must be made, Aoki had declared from the steps of the magistrate's office. His voice devoid of emotion as Manzo, despite his pleas of innocence and the headman's desperate intercessions, was tied to the village's central notice board, stripped to the waist. Left exposed to the biting night wind. His cries for mercy eventually faded into whimpers, then silence. Kira's hands clenched until her knuckles were white. This was her father's story, replayed with a different victim. A different stage, but the same script of arbitrary cruelty, the same disproportionate punishment. She forced herself to walk on, her heart a block of ice. To interfere was to invite ruin upon her own family, to paint a target on her mother and Kenji. Survival demanded acquiescence, a bowed head, a silent tongue. She sought out Kenjiro, the aging retainer of the once respectable, now impoverished, samurai Katawaki family. The Katawakis, whose small estate bordered Ogawa, had always been relatively benign masters, their demands less crushing than some. Kira's family had served them for generations before her father's. Crippling. Kenjiro, a man whose lined face spoke of countless Akita winters and faded glories, lived in a small, neat dwelling on the edge of the Katawaki property. A testament to his enduring loyalty to a house that could offer him little more than shelter. He was often found polishing his old, rarely used armor, a relic from a more turbulent era, or practicing sword kata with a slow, meticulous grace that hinted at former prowess. His movements a poignant echo of a warrior's past. Kenjiro-sama, Kira said, offering a small bundle of dried shiitake mushrooms she had managed to find on a fallen log, a rare winter treat. A humble offering for your health. He accepted it with a grave nod. His eyes, though old, still sharp and discerning. He gestured for her to sit on a worn tatami mat. The inspector makes the air heavy, child. Even the birds seem to sing less. He does, Kenjiro-sama. Old Manzo. It is unjust. He meant no defiance. Kenjiro sighed, a sound like dry leaves rustling in an autumn wind. Justice, Kira, is a word lords use to dress their will. Aoki-sama serves his lord, as I serve mine. Lord Katawaki, however, diminished his fortunes. The paths are different, the weight of duty, for a true samurai, is the same. He paused, looking at her intently. His gaze seeming to penetrate her carefully constructed composure. Your father was a good man, skilled with his hands. He understood the beauty in wood, the honesty of a straight line. The spirit within the grain. Some only understand the sharp edge of a blade, the unyielding line of the law. Is there no other way, then? Kira asked, the question a raw ache in her throat, a plea against the bleakness he described. Must we always bend, or break? There are always other ways, Kenjiro said, his gaze distant, fixed on the snow falling softly outside his shoji screen. But they are often hidden, like a path through a dense forest. Known only to the hunter or the hermit, and fraught with peril. Some paths are not meant for lone travelers. And some, he added, his voice dropping, are best not taken at all if one values peace, however thin. He offered no more, turning back to a piece of his armor, the rhythmic rasp of the polishing cloth filling the small, chilly room. Kira understood. He was warning her. But also, perhaps, acknowledging the fire he saw smoldering within her. A fire he himself might have once possessed before the years and hardships had banked it to embers. The pressure from Aoki's investigation continued, relentless and methodical. He seemed to derive a perverse satisfaction from dissecting the village's life, uncovering every hidden fear. Every hoarded grain of rice, every whispered discontent. One day, Haruto was tasked with resurveying the boundaries of the rice paddies, a tedious job that brought him once again into the villager's sphere, his transit lines and measuring ropes a physical imposition on their land. Kira, mending a fishing net by the nearly frozen stream, its waters sluggish and dark, watched him. He worked diligently, his brow furrowed in concentration, his breath misting in the air, but there was a hesitancy in his movements. A lack of Aoki's chilling certainty, as if he were performing a task whose purpose he did not fully embrace. He even paused once to help a child retrieve a dropped toy, a small, human gesture that Aoki would have undoubtedly scorned. Aoki then summoned Taro, a young farmer whose family was known to be struggling even more than most. Taro's wife had recently given birth, and the winter had been particularly cruel to them. Their stores depleted. The charge, falsifying the number of able-bodied workers in his household on the previous year's declaration to reduce his tax assessment. The evidence was a discrepancy in an old census scroll. Stored in the magistrate's dusty archives, a faded document easily attributable to a scribe's error, a misunderstanding, or the simple fact that lives changed, people died. Children were born. But Aoki, in his precise, uninflected voice, presented it as deliberate, calculated deception. Taro, a sturdy man reduced to a trembling wreck, stammered his denials. His wife, pale and weak, clutched their swaddled newborn, her eyes wide with a primal panic. Kira watched, her stomach churning with a mixture of nausea and cold fury. This was it again. The system, ostensibly designed to maintain order and ensure the prosperity of the realm, was crushing the life out of the very people it was supposed to protect, grinding them into the frozen earth like unwanted chaff. She saw Haruto standing near Aoki. His face pale beneath his samurai topknot, his knuckles white where he gripped the hilt of his shorter sword, the wakizashi. He looked away when his eyes met Kira's, a flush rising on his neck. He was a witness, complicit in his silence. That night, Kira could not sleep. The image of Taro's terrified face, his wife's silent, abject despair, haunted her. The Kyoho reforms, Shogun Yashimun's grand plan for a stronger, more solvent Japan, felt like a distant, abstract concept here in Ogawa, as remote as the emperor in Kyoto. Here, it was just fear, hunger, and the cold steel of Aoki's implacable will. What good were reforms if they were wielded like a club, indiscriminately, by men who saw only numbers and statutes, not human suffering? She remembered something her father had once said, looking at a particularly gnarled piece of cherry wood he was coaxing into a beautiful panel. Even the most twisted grain has a heart. Kira. You just have to find it, and work with it, not against it. Could there be a heart in this twisted system, or in the men who served it? Men like Haruto. She thought of Haruto's averted gaze, the tension in his posture. He was not like Aoki. He lacked that core of icy certainty, that relish for power. Perhaps. A desperate idea began to form in her mind, a fragile, dangerous seed of defiance. It was not about open rebellion, that was her father's unwitting path, and it had led to ruin. This would have to be different. It would have to be a path through the hidden places, like the ones Kenjiro had spoken of, a subtle pressure applied at a weak point. She knew the old magistrate's compound where Aoki was staying. Her father had done some repair work there years ago, fitting new shoji screens, mending a leaking roof. And Kira had sometimes accompanied him, carrying his tools or fetching water. She remembered a disused storage shed at the back, near the kitchens, its lock flimsy, its windows askew and covered in grime. Aoki's men were quartered in the main building, their discipline tight. But their supplies, their less important records. Extra ink and paper. Those might be less carefully guarded, less rigorously watched. The next day, feigning an errand to deliver some mended sacks to the magistrate's cook, an old woman named Setsu who had sometimes given Kira scraps of food and a kind word in better times, she managed to observe the compound's routines. Aoki was meticulous, almost pathologically so. His personal documents, the core of his authority, would be secure. But the day-to-day paperwork, the hastily scribbled notes of his underlings, the records of confiscated goods, these were handled with less precision, often left to junior samurai more concerned with appearing busy than with true diligence. She noticed one of Aoki's junior samurai, a nervous young man named Tanaka Kenji, was responsible for tallying confiscated goods. Tanaka was often flustered, easily intimidated by Aoki, and prone to making small errors which he then tried to cover up with an excess of obsequiousness. Kira had seen him once drop a scroll and hastily re-roll it, his face flushed crimson, before Aoki could notice. If there was a weak link in Aoki's chain of command, it was Tanaka, whose fear outweighed his competence. Her plan was audacious, terrifyingly so, and the risks made her breath catch in her throat. Taro's case rested on the alleged discrepancy in the old census. But what if there was another discrepancy? A more recent one that pointed not to peasant deceit, but to inefficiency or even minor corruption within Aoki's own carefully chosen team, something that might make Aoki pause. If only to protect his own meticulously crafted reputation for flawless administration and incorruptibility before his superiors in Sendai. She needed to find something tangible. And she needed to ensure Haruto, the one samurai who had shown a flicker of unease, a hint of a troubled conscience, was the one to discover it. To bring it to Aoki's attention in a way that could not be easily dismissed. He was the only one who might, just might, have the courage and the standing to voice a doubt, however small. Under the cloak of a moonless, starless night, the kind that swallowed sounds and shapes, Kira's heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, she slipped away from her hut. Kenji and her mother were asleep, their breathing shallow in the cold air. The village was utterly silent, save for the sighing of the wind through the thatched roofs and the distant, mournful hoot of an owl from the dark woods, a sound some said was an omen. She wore dark, homespun clothes, her movements practiced from years of moving quietly through the forest, blending with the shadows. The small, sharp knife her father had used for carving wood, its blade still keen, was tucked into her obi, not as a weapon of aggression, she told herself, but as a tool, a last resort if she were cornered. Reaching the magistrate's compound, she skirted the main building, avoiding the occasional sleepy sentry, her bare feet making no sound on the cold, packed earth. The storage shed loomed before her, a darker shape against the inky sky. The lock, as she remembered, was old and rusted, a simple iron hasp. With a bit of careful pressure from the tip of her father's knife, it gave way with a faint, grating groan that sounded deafening in the oppressive stillness. She froze, listening, but only the wind answered. Inside, the shed was cluttered and smelled of damp wood, old paper, decaying straw, and the sharp tang of mouse droppings. By the faint light filtering through a grimy, cobweb-strewn windowpane, she began her search. Piles of confiscated tools, rusty sickles, a broken hoe, a fishing net with a gaping hole, lay in one corner. Sacks of what looked like low-quality grain, probably deemed unfit for the domain lord's stores, were stacked against a wall. And everywhere, there were scrolls, old tax receipts, land surveys yellowed with age. Lists of household goods from families long gone. Her fingers, nimble despite the numbing cold, sifted through everything. Time was her enemy. Each creak of the shed's ancient timbers, each gust of wind rattling the loose window, sent a jolt of pure, undiluted fear through her. This was madness. If caught. Most of the scrolls were mundane, irrelevant. Then, tucked beneath a pile of moldy straw mats, she found a newer ledger, its cover bound in cheap blue cloth, the kind used for everyday records. It seemed to be Tanaka Kenji's informal tally of goods brought in under Aoki's recent orders, his personal accounting before the official scrolls were prepared. Her breath caught. Tanaka's script was hurried, almost childish, full of corrections and smudges of ink. She scanned the entries, her literacy, hard-won from Granny Chio in secret moments, now her most potent tool. Most entries were small, insignificant, a few extra measures of rice here. A worn sickle there, a single clay pot. But one entry, dated just a few days prior, made her pause, her blood running a little colder. It detailed a confiscation of several bolts of good quality indigo-dyed cotton cloth from a weaver in a neighboring village, the one Aoki had made an example of early on. The official reason cited was failure to meet domain levy for textiles. Kira knew the weaver, a hard-working widow named Hana, whose skill was renowned in the district. It was highly unlikely Hana, who struggled to feed her own children, would have hoarded such valuable cloth when her own family was threadbare and the domain demanded its due. More importantly, Kira remembered seeing Tanaka himself wearing a new under-kimono shitage. Of a very similar, distinctive deep blue cotton just yesterday. It had seemed out of place, a small, uncharacteristic luxury for a junior samurai, especially one as timid as Tanaka. The color and weave had been striking. Could it be? Had Tanaka, perhaps emboldened by Aoki's climate of fear and seizure, or perhaps simply foolish and opportunistic, helped himself to some of the confiscated goods? It was a small thing in the grand scheme of domain politics, a minor corruption, a petty theft. But in Aoki's rigidly ordered world, where unquestionable authority and incorruptibility were paramount, any hint of impropriety within his own ranks could be a significant embarrassment. Especially if brought to light by someone outside his immediate control, or worse, by a subordinate with a sudden attack of conscience. Kira carefully, meticulously, using a sliver of charcoal she carried, copied the incriminating entry onto a small, torn piece of paper she had brought, mimicking Tanaka's clumsy, spidery handwriting as best she could. She also noted the date and the specific description of the cloth, 5 bolts. Indigo cotton, fine weave. This was not direct proof of Taro's innocence concerning the census. But it was a stone, a sharp-edged stone, she could throw into Aoki's placid pond of self-righteousness, hoping the ripples would be disruptive enough. Her task now was to get this into Haruto's hands, or at least into his path, without revealing herself as the source. She knew Haruto often took a solitary walk along the riverbank in the early morning, before his official duties began and before Aoki's demanding presence dominated his day. He still carried his sketchbook, his one visible escape from the rigid discipline of Aoki's service. A small rebellion of the spirit. Before the first hint of gray light touched the eastern sky, Kira, her mission accomplished, slipped back to the riverbank, her heart still racing with a mixture of fear and a strange, exhilarating sense of purpose. She found a hollow in the gnarled roots of the ancient, snow-dusted pine Haruto often sketched, a place sheltered from the wind. She tucked the small, incriminating note deep within, weighting it with a smooth, dark river pebble, hoping it would look like something accidentally dropped and forgotten by one of Tanaka's careless underlings. Or even by Tanaka himself. It was a desperate, fragile gamble. He might not see it. If he did, he might ignore it, or worse, report it directly to Aoki as a sign of further peasant deceit. But her intuition, her desperate hope, rested on that flicker of unease she had seen in him. The day of Taro's final judgment arrived, cold and gray, the sky pregnant with more snow. The villagers were gathered in the magistrate's compound's dusty courtyard. Their faces etched with a familiar fear and a bleak resignation. Aoki sat on a raised platform, a low table before him, his expression unreadable, a ledger open before him. Taro stood before him, trembling visibly, his wife, her face pale and tear-streaked, clutching their swaddled infant nearby, her silent sobs shaking her thin frame. Kira stood at the edge of the crowd, her hands hidden in the sleeves of her worn kimono, her gaze fixed on Haruto, who stood to Aoki's right, his face pale and drawn, his eyes focused on some distant point above the villagers' heads. Had he found the note, did he understand its implication, or was she about to witness another life destroyed, her desperate, nocturnal efforts all in vain? Aoki began to speak, his voice cutting through the tense silence like a whip. "Taro, son of Jiro. You have been found guilty of deceiving the shogun's officials, of falsifying records to evade your lawful obligations. Such acts of duplicity undermine the very fabric of order and stability that his lordship, the shogun, strives to maintain. The penalty for such deceit is severe." As Aoki paused for dramatic effect, letting his words hang heavy in the frigid air, Haruto shifted uneasily. He took a small, almost imperceptible step forward, then hesitated. His hand instinctively going to the hilt of his sword. Kira held her breath, her own heart seeming to stop. This was the moment. The fate of Taro, and perhaps her own if her actions were discovered, hung in the balance. "Inspector Aoki-sama," Haruto began, his voice surprisingly steady, though Kira, watching him intently, could see a fine tremor in his hands, the only outward sign of his internal struggle. "If I may. A matter has come to my attention this very morning that might warrant further consideration before judgment is passed upon this man." Aoki's eyes, cold and sharp as obsidian chips, narrowed. "Speak, Haruto Dano. But be brief. Justice should not be delayed by trivialities or peasant sentiment." His tone was a clear warning. "It is not a triviality, Aoki-sama, nor is it born of sentiment," Haruto said, his voice gaining a little more strength, a surprising resolve hardening his youthful features. He reached into the sleeve of his haori and produced a small, crumpled piece of paper, Kira's note. "This morning, during my patrol, I found this near the storage sheds. It appears to be a page from an informal ledger, detailing certain discrepancies in the accounting of confiscated goods. Specifically, an entry concerning 5 bolts of fine indigo cotton cloth taken from the weaver Hana of Shimizu village." He did not mention Tanaka Kenji by name, but the implication, for those within Aoki's retinue, was clear. "If there are inaccuracies, however minor, in one area of our record-keeping, perhaps it is possible there are unintentional errors elsewhere. Even in the old census scrolls pertaining to Taro's household, scrolls penned many years ago." A hush, absolute and profound, fell over the courtyard. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Aoki's face, for the first time since his arrival in Ogawa, registered something other than cold, implacable command. It was a flicker of genuine surprise, quickly masked by a layer of ice, then a dangerous, predatory glint of anger. He stared at Haruto, then at the note Haruto held out, as if it were a venomous snake. Tanaka Kenji, standing amongst the other junior samurai, went deathly pale. His eyes darting around like a cornered rat. "Discrepancies," Aoki's voice was dangerously soft, a silken threat. "Are you suggesting, Haruto Dano, that my administration, carried out under the direct orders of Lord Date, is anything less than meticulous and beyond reproach?" "Not at all, Aoki-sama," Haruto replied, bowing his head respectfully but not backing down, his gaze steady. "My only concern is for the unimpeachable integrity of your investigation. I merely suggest that, in the diligent pursuit of perfect order, even the most dedicated can sometimes overlook small details, or be ill-served by subordinates. Perhaps a thorough review of all recent confiscation records, alongside Taro's case, would ensure that justice is not only done, but is seen by all to be impeccably fair. To protect the integrity of your own excellent work, of course, and to ensure no shadow falls upon your report. To Sendai." Kira almost gasped. Haruto had taken her crude, desperate stone and polished it into a sharp, effective argument, framing it not as an accusation against Aoki, but as a concern for Aoki's own reputation and the honor of their lord. It was a masterstroke of subtle defiance, wrapped in the impeccably correct language of loyalty and duty. He had found the heart of the twisted grain. Aoki was silent for a long, agonizing moment, his gaze boring into Haruto, trying to dissect his motives, to find a weakness. The tension in the courtyard was so thick Kira felt she could taste it, metallic. Like fear, like the edge of a sword. He knew he was being challenged, however respectfully, however indirectly. To dismiss Haruto's point now, especially with the mention of specific goods and the visible, abject panic on Tanaka Kenji's face, might raise unwanted questions among the other samurai present, or even, Kami forbid, invite scrutiny from his superiors in Sendai if word of potential irregularities within his own team got out. Aoki prized his reputation for ruthless efficiency and incorruptibility above all else. Finally, Aoki let out a slow, deliberate breath, the sound barely audible. "Very well, Haruto Dano. Your diligence in such minor matters is noted." The words were laced with an icy displeasure that promised future retribution. "This court will adjourn. Taro's judgment is deferred pending a thorough review of all pertinent records, including those of recent confiscations. I expect absolute accuracy from all my men." He shot a venomous, withering look at Tanaka Kenji, who flinched as if struck by a physical blow. Then, his gaze swept over the crowd, lingering for a fraction of a second too long on Kira's bowed head before he rose abruptly and stalked back into the magistrate's building, his silk robes rustling like dry, angry leaves. The villagers slowly dispersed, murmuring in hushed, astonished tones, not daring to look at each other, not daring to hope too much. Taro's wife was sobbing with a raw animal relief, clutching her husband's arm as if he had been pulled back from the very edge of a precipice. Kira felt a wave of dizziness wash over her, her knees weak. It had worked, or at least, it had bought time. She had thrown her stone, and it had made a ripple, a significant, unexpected ripple in the frozen pond of Aoki's authority. In the immediate aftermath of the adjournment, the atmosphere in the magistrate's compound was thick with unspoken accusations and simmering resentments, a palpable tension that even the cooks and stable hands could feel. Aoki, though maintaining his outward composure before most, was clearly furious. He summoned Tanaka Kenji for a private, undoubtedly brutal, interrogation. Sounds of muffled shouts and what might have been the sharp crack of a bamboo rod against flesh drifted from the room Aoki had claimed as his office. Later, Tanaka emerged, his face bruised, one eye swollen shut, and his spirit visibly broken, his new blue under-kimono conspicuously absent. He was immediately reassigned to the most menial tasks, cleaning latrines and tending to the horses, effectively ostracized and humiliated before his peers. Haruto, too, faced Aoki's wrath, albeit in a more controlled, psychologically cutting setting. Kira, while delivering a basket of foraged greens to the cook, Setsu, for the samurai's evening meal, overheard snippets of their exchange through a thin shoji screen. Aoki's voice was a low, venomous hiss, each word precisely chosen to inflict maximum damage. He accused Haruto of insubordination, of allowing foolish peasant sentiment to cloud his judgment, of a dangerous naivety unbecoming a samurai of his lineage and potential. Haruto's responses were respectful in tone, but firm in substance, reiterating his duty to ensure all facts were considered before a man's fate was sealed. He did not mention Kira or the true source of the note, taking full responsibility for bringing the discrepancy to light. "Your loyalty, Haruto Dano, appears to be misplaced, or perhaps, underdeveloped," Aoki had concluded, his tone glacial. "You will find, in due course, that such misplaced loyalties and ill-considered actions have significant consequences for one's career. Lord Date values efficiency and unwavering obedience above all else." The unspoken threat hung heavy in the air. Kira's heart ached for Haruto. He had taken a significant risk, one that could indeed damage his future prospects within the rigid hierarchy of the Date clan samurai. Yet, a part of her also felt a grudging admiration, a surprising warmth. He had acted, not out of personal gain, but from a nascent sense of justice, however imperfectly understood or articulated. He had chosen a difficult path. The thorough review of records dragged on for several agonizingly slow days. Aoki, his reputation for flawless efficiency now subtly undermined, was forced to proceed with a meticulous caution that was clearly anathema to him. He knew he was being watched. Not just by the frightened villagers, but by his own men, some of whom might harbor their own ambitions or resentments. And perhaps, he suspected, even by unseen eyes reporting back to his rivals, or superiors in Sendai. The small crack Kira had introduced into his perfectly polished facade had widened, revealing the potential for fallibility beneath. During this period, Kira had a brief, almost silent encounter with Haruto. He was overseeing the loading of some supplies bound for Kubota, his expression somber and preoccupied. As she passed, carrying a heavy water bucket from the well, their eyes met. He gave a barely perceptible nod, a flicker of acknowledgement in his weary eyes that spoke volumes. No words were exchanged. None were needed. A fragile, unspoken understanding had formed between them, a recognition of a shared, dangerous moment, a bond forged in the crucible of quiet defiance. Kenjiro, when Kira next saw him, mending a tear in an old Katawaki banner bearing the faded crest of a hawk, offered his own quiet commentary. A small pebble can change the course of a stream. Kira, he said, his fingers, though gnarled with age, still surprisingly deft. It can create an eddy, a new current. But the river still flows to the sea, and the sea is vast. His words were a reminder. A gentle tempering of any nascent triumph she might feel. This was a reprieve, not a revolution. The system, vast and powerful as the ocean, remained. Finally, after what felt like an eternity to Taro and his family, Aoki reconvened the court. The villagers gathered once more in the dusty courtyard, their hope a fragile thing, easily crushed, tinged with a deep-seated trepidation. Aoki's face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes like chips of ice. He announced that, upon review, certain minor administrative irregularities and instances of clerical sloppiness had indeed been found, not only in Taro's case but elsewhere within the domain's older records. He attributed them, with a dismissive wave of his hand, to the inherent laxity of previous local record keepers and the general deceitfulness and cunning inherent in the peasant class, who will always seek to evade their obligations. He made no mention of Tanaka's specific transgression or the blue cotton. However, he conceded, the specific evidence against Taro regarding the willful falsification of the census was insufficiently corroborated by current standards of evidence to warrant the most severe punishment. Taro was declared guilty of a lesser offense, failure to maintain accurate household records and promptly report changes in household status, and find a small amount of rice. A burden still, especially after a poor harvest, but one that would not destroy his family or send him into debt servitude. He was released, stumbling with a sob of pure relief into his wife's arms. The tension in the courtyard broke, a collective sigh escaping the gathered peasants, a sound as soft as falling snow. Aoki then delivered a chilling warning to the entire village about the shogun's unwavering expectation of obedience and the dire consequences of any future misunderstandings or attempts to obstruct the course of justice. His gaze, when it fell on Kira, was like a physical touch, cold and sharp and lingering. He knew, or at least strongly suspected, her involvement, her subtle hand in this affair. But he had no proof, no way to act without further damaging his own authority. By appearing vindictive over such a seemingly minor challenge from a mere peasant girl. His pride would not allow it. The following week, Inspector Aoki Eiji and his retinue departed Ogawa, their horses kicking up dust from the frozen road. Tanaka Kenji was left behind, demoted to serve as a lowly clerk in the local magistrate's office, a constant, humiliated reminder of Aoki's displeasure and a warning to others. Haruto, Kira learned from Setsu the cook, who had a network of informants among the servants in Kubota, had been reassigned to a remote garrison post on the northernmost border of the Date domain. Near Izoki, a clear punishment, an effective exile from any path of influence or advancement. His act of conscience had cost him dearly. As Aoki rode out, he paused at the village edge, his eyes sweeping over the bowing peasants. He did not look at Kira directly, but she felt his gaze pass over her. A silent promise of future scrutiny should their paths ever cross again. It was a look that said, "I will not forget." Life in Ogawa slowly, cautiously, returned to its familiar rhythms, though forever changed by the inspector's visit. The palpable fear had receded, replaced by a weary caution, a deeper understanding of the precariousness of their existence. The new taxes were still a heavy burden, the Kyoho reform still a distant, impersonal force shaping their lives. But something had shifted within Kira. She had faced the embodiment of the power that had destroyed her father and, in her own small, terrified way, she had pushed back. She had not toppled the mountain, but she had shown that even the smallest hand, guided by a keen mind and a courageous heart, could dislodge a stone. She continued to care for her mother, whose cough seemed a little easier now, and for Kenji, who was slowly regaining some of his boyish boisterousness. Her days were filled with the familiar tasks of survival, foraging, mending, helping neighbors when she could. But now, her observations were sharper, her resolve a little stronger, her understanding of the world more nuanced. She knew the risks. Knew the vastness of the power arrayed against people like her. Yet, she also knew that silence and passive acceptance were not the only options. There were other paths. Hidden and dangerous, but navigable. Kenjiro, watching her one day as she expertly splinted a broken branch on a young plum tree in the Katawaki garden, a tree that might one day bear fruit, remarked, his voice raspy with age, "The willow bends in the wind, Kira. The oak resists, and often breaks. You have learned to bend when necessary. But also to find the strength in yielding, to use the wind to your advantage." Kira simply nodded, a small, thoughtful smile gracing her lips as she gently tied the splint with hemp cord. The Kyoho era would continue, its reforms and its hardships. The lords in Edo and Sendai would issue their decrees, the samurai would enforce them with varying degrees of zeal and compassion. But in the quiet corners of remote villages like Ogawa, in the hearts of ordinary people like herself, the seeds of resilience, of quiet defiance, of an unyielding spirit, would continue to be sown, to take root, to perhaps, one day, even blossom. The river of history, as Kenjiro had said, still flowed inexorably to the sea. But sometimes, a single, well-placed pebble could indeed change its course, if only for a moment. If only in one small, vital way. And sometimes, Kira thought, her gaze drifting towards the distant, snow-capped peaks of the O Mountains, a moment was enough to keep a flicker of hope alive in the long, harsh winter of their lives. The taste of that small victory, however fleeting, was not bitter, but held the faintest promise of a distant, elusive spring. The impermanence of Aoki's absolute control in her village. The shift in Haruto's rigid worldview, her own transformation from a girl consumed by passive grief to a young woman capable of active, albeit subtle, resistance, these were the undeniable currents beneath the surface of an seemingly unchanging feudal order. The feudal system, with its samurai enforcers and rigid hierarchies, remained the dominant feature of the landscape, as unyielding as the winter frost that clung to the bare branches. Yet, Kira had learned that even within such a system, individual agency, however small, however fraught with peril, could exist. It was a dangerous knowledge, one that could lead to further hardship, but it was also a profoundly liberating one. Her father's memory no longer just fueled her anger and her sorrow. It now also fueled a quiet determination to navigate the treacherous currents of her world with as much integrity and courage as she could muster. The historical evolution of Japanese feudalism was not just a grand narrative of shoguns and epic battles recorded in official chronicles. It was also the sum of countless small, personal struggles like hers, shaping the character of the land and its people in ways often unseen, unrecorded by those who only looked at the surface of power. Her small act of defiance, born of grief and a yearning for a sliver of justice, was a tiny thread in that vast, complex tapestry. And as the seasons turned in Akita, that thread, though almost invisible to the wider world, held fast, a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. Kira knew her journey was far from over. The path ahead was still shadowed and uncertain. But now, she walked it with her eyes open, not just to the dangers, but also to the possibilities, however faint, that lay hidden within the intricate weave of her world. The wind still blew cold from the north, but it no longer seemed to carry only despair. Now, it whispered of resilience. The Kyoho reforms, intended to streamline the shogunate's power and finances, continued to exert pressure across the land. For Ogawa, this meant the continued presence of local magistrates, less overtly threatening than Aoki, but equally bound by the dictates of Sendai and Edo. The years that followed were a tapestry woven with hardship and small joys. Kira's mother, Otsu, remained frail, but Kira's knowledge of herbs, gleaned from Granny Chio and honed through necessity, kept the worst of her ailments at bay. Kenji grew into a sturdy young man, his father's skill with wood beginning to show in his hands, though opportunities to use such skills for more than mending village tools were scarce. Kira herself became a quiet pillar in the village, her advice sought in hushed tones, her remedies shared freely. She never spoke of her role in Aoki's thwarted judgment of Taro. But an unspoken respect settled around her. Taro and his family, forever grateful, often left small offerings of preserved vegetables or a share of a rare catch from the river at her doorstep. The memory of Haruto, the young samurai exiled for his act of conscience, sometimes surfaced in Kira's thoughts. She wondered about his fate in the harsh northern garrisons of Izoki, a land of Ainu and even colder winters. Had his flicker of idealism been extinguished, or had it found new, unexpected paths? It was a question without an answer, a loose thread in the fabric of her past. Kenjiro, Lord Katawaki's retainer, grew older, his movements slower, but his mind remained sharp. He continued to be a source of gruff wisdom for Kira. He taught Kenji some basic sword forms. Not for combat, for what peasant would dare raise a sword, but for discipline, for the connection to a tradition that, however flawed, held a certain austere beauty. The way of the warrior is not just about fighting, boy, Kenjiro would say, his voice raspy. It is about preparedness. About seeing clearly, about knowing when to act and when to endure. One autumn, when Kenji was nearly 16, a new crisis befell Ogawa. A blight struck the rice paddies throughout the district, a creeping sickness that turned the promising green stalks to a sickly yellow, the grains within them shriveled and worthless. This was not the targeted malice of an Inspector Aoki, but the indifferent cruelty of nature, a force even more implacable. Famine, the gaunt specter that always haunted the edges of their lives, now loomed large and terrifying. The domain authorities in Kubota offered little help. Their own granaries were under strain, and the priority was always to feed the samurai and the castle town. Ogawa, like many outlying villages, was largely left to fend for itself. Ichiro, the headman, wrung his hands, his face a mask of despair. Villagers began to hoard what little they had. Suspicion and fear poisoning the usual communal spirit. Kira watched the unfolding desperation with a heavy heart. Her own family's stores were meager. She redoubled her efforts foraging in the woods, but the forest, too, seemed to withhold its bounty. The usual nuts and berries were scarce, the edible roots tougher and less nutritious. The shadow of starvation touched every household. One evening, as a cold rain lashed their small hut, Kenji spoke, his voice tight with a young man's frustration. "It is always the same, Kira-ne. We toil, we suffer. And the Lord's take. Now even the heavens forsake us. Is there no end to it?" Kira looked at her brother, seeing not just his anger, but his fear. "There is always an end, Kenji," she said softly, stirring the thin millet gruel that was their supper. "But sometimes, we must find our own way through the storm, not wait for it to pass." Her mind went back to the storage shed at the magistrate's compound, to the desperate gamble she had taken years ago. That had been about injustice. This was about survival, but perhaps the principle was the same, to look for the hidden path, the overlooked resource, the unexpected leverage. She remembered tales from Granny Chio, old legends of a hidden valley deep in the Old Mountains, a place where the game was plentiful and the soil richer, a place known only to a few. Protected by treacherous paths and the spirits of the mountains. Most dismissed these as folktales, but Granny Chio had spoken of them with a strange certainty. She had even described certain landmarks, certain unusual rock formations that marked the way. It was a wild, desperate thought. The mountains were dangerous, especially with winter approaching. But starvation was a certainty if they stayed. "Kenji," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Do you remember the stories Granny Chio used to tell, about a valley beyond the frozen falls?" Kenji frowned. "The old tales, of a hunter's paradise, surely, Ne-san, those are just stories to comfort children." "Perhaps," Kira said. "But Granny Chio saw many things others did not. And what have we to lose by looking? The forest here offers nothing. The storehouses are empty." A flicker of something, fear, excitement, desperation, crossed Kenji's face. "The mountains are treacherous. And if the samurai find us leaving the village without permission?" "We will not ask for permission," Kira said, her resolve hardening. "We will go quietly, by night. We will take only what we can carry. And we will find this valley. Or we will perish trying. It is a better death than slow starvation here, watching our mother fade." The decision, once made, brought a strange clarity. Over the next few days, Kira and Kenji made their secret preparations. They mended their warmest clothes, sharpened Kenji's small wood axe, and gathered what few dried provisions they could spare. Kira packed her precious herbs, her father's knife, and a tinderbox. Otsu, their mother, sensing their desperate plan, wept quietly but did not try to dissuade them. She knew, perhaps better than they, the grim alternative. On a moonless night, much like the one when Kira had crept into Aoki's storage shed, they slipped out of Ogawa. Kenjiro was the only one Kira confided in, leaving him a small portion of their remaining herbs for Lord Katawaki, a gesture of respect. The old samurai had looked at her with his piercing gaze, then simply said, "The hawk leaves the nest when it must, Kira. Fly true. May the mountain spirits guide your path." He pressed a small, whetstone into her hand. "Keep your father's knife sharp. A dull blade is a faithless friend." The journey into the O Mountains was brutal. The paths Granny Chio had described were overgrown, often treacherous. The wind howled through the high passes, carrying the first flurries of winter snow. Their meager rations dwindled. Otsu, frail to begin with, weakened with each passing day, her breath growing shallower. Kira used her herbs to fight off fevers and chills, but she knew time was running out. Kenji, though young and strong, began to show the strain, his face gaunt, his youthful optimism eroded by the relentless hardship. Kira, driven by a fierce, protective love for her family and a stubborn refusal to surrender, pushed onward. She matched Granny Chio's remembered landmarks, a lightning-struck cedar, a rock shaped like a sleeping bear, a stream that flowed uphill for a short distance before disappearing into the earth. Doubt gnawed at her. Were these just coincidences? Was she leading her family to their doom on the strength of an old woman's fireside tales? One evening, as Otsu lay shivering uncontrollably in a makeshift shelter of pine boughs, her breath a ragged whisper, Kira felt despair closing in. Kenji sat hunched, his head in his hands. "It is no use, Nei-san," he muttered. "We should have stayed. At least we would have died among our own." Kira looked at her mother's pale, still face, then at her brother's defeated posture. The old anger, the familiar resilience, surged within her. "No," she said, her voice hoarse but firm. "Father would not have given up." Granny Chio did not speak in riddles without reason. "We are close. I feel it." She did not know if she believed her own words, but she had to. She rose, taking her father's knife. "Stay with mother. I will scout ahead. Just a little further." She pushed through a dense thicket of rhododendrons, their leaves stiff with frost. The ground sloped steeply downwards. And then, she saw it. Below her, nestled between two towering, snow-capped peaks, lay a small, sheltered valley, untouched by the blight that had ravaged the lowlands. A thin plume of smoke rose from what looked like a collection of rude huts near a clear, fast-flowing stream. The air here felt milder, protected from the harshest winds. Patches of green, incredibly vibrant against the encroaching winter, hinted at fertile soil. It was the hidden valley. Granny Chio's tales were true. Tears streamed down Kira's face. Tears of relief, of exhaustion, of a desperate, overwhelming gratitude. She turned and scrambled back to Kenji and her mother, her voice choked with emotion. "Kenji, mother, I found it, we are saved." The inhabitants of the hidden valley, a small, reclusive community of hunters and subsistence farmers who had long ago retreated from the harshness of domain rule, were wary at first. But seeing Otsu's desperate condition and the sincerity in Kira's plea, they offered shelter and food, roasted game, hearty mountain vegetables, and a potent, warming brew made from fermented berries. For several weeks, Kira and her family recovered their strength. Otsu, tended by Kira and an elderly woman from the valley skilled in mountain remedies, slowly began to rally. Kenji, his youthful energy returning, learned hunting snares and tracking skills from the valley men. Kira, in turn, shared her knowledge of lowland herbs and basic literacy, teaching the valley children their letters with charcoal on smooth pieces of bark. The valley was not a paradise. Life was still hard, a constant negotiation with the elements. But there was a sense of freedom here, an absence of the crushing fear and rigid hierarchy that had defined their lives in Ogawa. The people were self-reliant, their laws simple, their connection to the land profound. They revered the mountain spirits, their Shinto beliefs interwoven with a practical understanding of nature's cycles. They had little, but they shared what they had. It was a different kind of feudalism, perhaps, one based on mutual dependence and respect for the natural world rather than on the dictates of distant lords. As winter truly set in, blanketing the high peaks in deep snow and isolating the valley completely, Kira found a measure of peace she had never known. She learned to read the signs of the forest, to understand the language of the wind and the snow. She felt a connection to this wild, untamed place, a sense of belonging that had always eluded her in the structured world below. But even in this remote sanctuary, the outside world was not entirely forgotten. One of the valley elders, a man named Jirobi, who had once ventured into the lowlands as a young man, possessed a few tattered scrolls, a copy of the Taihiki, the epic tale of war and impermanence, and a collection of poems by Seijio, the wandering monk. He would sometimes read from them by the firelight, his voice a low rumble. And Kira would listen, fascinated by the stories of samurai valor, of courtly intrigue, of the fleeting beauty of the world, a world so different, yet so connected to her own small existence. The historical and cultural evolution of Japanese feudalism and the samurai class was not just an abstract concept. It was a living, breathing reality whose tendrils reached even into this hidden mountain refuge. One day, Jirobi, observing Kira as she skillfully dressed a wound for a child who had fallen, said, "You have a healer's hands, girl. And a survivor's spirit. But your heart still carries the shadows of the lowlands." Kira knew he spoke the truth. The memory of Aoki, the injustice her father suffered, the fate of Haruto, these things were a part of her. The hidden valley was a sanctuary. But it could not erase the past. And as she looked out at the snow-covered peaks that ringed their refuge, she wondered if her journey was truly over, or if the currents of fate would one day draw her back into the wider, more turbulent world beyond the mountains. The impermanence of their current. Peace, like the fleeting beauty of a single snowflake, was a truth she now understood in her bones. The long Akita winter passed, a season of hardship but also of quiet community in the hidden valley. Otsu regained a measure of her health, the clean mountain air and simple, nourishing food proving more effective than any of Kira's lowland remedies alone. Kenji, under the tutelage of Jirobi's son, Taro, a common name. It seemed, for sturdy young men, became a proficient hunter, his skill with a bow and arrow surprisingly adept. He moved with a new confidence, the shadow of peasant subservience lifting from his shoulders. Kira, too, found her place. Her knowledge of herbs, combined with the local remedies taught by the valley's elder women, made her an invaluable asset. She learned to identify the subtle signs of changing weather in the flight of birds and the rustle of leaves, to track game through the dense undergrowth, and to preserve food for the lean months. She also continued to teach the valley children. Her small school, a corner of the communal longhouse where she would scratch characters onto slate with a piece of chalky stone, her students a ragged but eager group. Reading Jirobi's worn copy of the Taihiki to them, simplifying the complex tales of battles and betrayals, she felt a strange connection to the grand sweep of history that had, until recently, felt so oppressive and remote. Here, it became stories, lessons in courage and folly, in loyalty and the ever-present shadow of impermanence. As spring finally began to breathe life back into the high country, melting the snows and sending torrents of water down the mountainsides, a restlessness stirred in Kira. The valley was safe, a haven. But it was also a cage, however gilded with peace. The world beyond the mountains, with its injustices and its challenges, still called to a part of her. Was it enough to simply survive, to hide from the storms, or did she have a duty, however small, to carry the lessons she had learned, the strength she had found, back into that world? The thought was unsettling. She had her mother and Kenji to consider. They were thriving here, free from the constant fear that had defined their lives in Ogawa. To leave the valley would be to invite danger, to risk everything they had gained. One evening, sitting with Jirobi by the communal fire, watching the sparks dance upwards towards the star-filled sky, she voiced some of her turmoil. "Jirobi-sama," she began hesitantly, "this valley. It has been a gift from the kami. But sometimes I feel the pull of the world below. Is it wrong to feel such a thing, when we have found safety here?" Jirobi poked the fire with a long stick, his weathered face thoughtful in the flickering light. "A bird born in a cage, Kira, may find comfort in its familiar bars. But a bird that has known the open sky, however harsh the winds, will always remember the feel of flight. You have tasted a different kind of freedom here, but you were also forged in the fires of the lowlands. Those fires leave their mark." He paused, then continued, "The world below is, as you say, full of injustice. But it is also where most people live, where the great currents of life flow. To turn one's back on it entirely, that is one choice. To re-enter it, knowing its dangers but armed with new strength, that is another. Neither is wrong, child. But each has its price." His words offered no easy answers, only a deeper understanding of her own internal conflict. The peace of the valley was real, but it felt borrowed, conditional. The memory of Inspector Aoki's cold eyes, the image of Taro the farmer's near condemnation, the thought of Haruto's exile, these injustices still festered. And what of Ogawa? Had the blight passed, or her old neighbors suffering still? The decision was precipitated by an unexpected arrival. One late spring day, a lone hunter from the valley, returning from a rare foray into the lower foothills, brought news. He had encountered a traveling merchant on a remote mountain pass, a man who spoke of continued hardship in the Akita domains. The blight had indeed been severe, and the domain lords, far from offering relief, had increased pressure to meet tax quotas, leading to scattered peasant unrest and brutal samurai crackdowns in several districts. He even mentioned Ogawa by name, saying it was a village struggling under a particularly harsh local magistrate, a man named Tanaka Kenji, who seemed determined to prove his zeal to his superiors. In Kubota after some past disgrace. Tanaka. The name struck Kira like a physical blow. The timid, incompetent samurai who had been Aoki's underling, the one whose minor corruption she had used to save Taro. Now, it seemed, he was in a position of power, and wielding it without mercy, likely trying to redeem himself in the eyes of his superiors by squeezing every last grain of rice from the starving peasants. The irony was bitter. Her small act of defiance had, in an unforeseen way, contributed to the suffering of her own village. The law of unintended consequences, as potent and unpredictable as any mountain storm. Kira's resolve solidified. She could not stay hidden while her people suffered, especially if her past actions had inadvertently played a role. She spoke to Otsu and Kenji that night. Her mother, though fearful, saw the familiar fire of determination in Kira's eyes and nodded her reluctant consent. "Your father would have understood," she whispered, her hand trembling as she touched Kira's cheek. Kenji, now a young man with a newfound confidence, insisted on accompanying her. "I will not let you face this alone, Nei-san. I am a hunter now. I can protect you. And Ogawa is our home too." And so, with the reluctant blessings of Jirobi and the valley people, who gifted them with dried meat, hearty grains, and warm furs, Kira and Kenji prepared to descend from their mountain sanctuary. As they stood at the pass, looking down at the distant, hazy lowlands, Jirobi gave Kira a small, carved wooden charm of a mountain hawk. "May it grant you clear sight and a strong heart, Kira. Remember the lessons of the valley. Bend like the willow, but strike like the hawk when the moment is right." The journey back to Ogawa was quicker than their ascent, though still arduous. They moved cautiously, avoiding main roads and samurai patrols. As they neared their village, the signs of hardship were unmistakable. The fields lay fallow and barren. The huts seemed more dilapidated, and an air of grim despair hung heavier than before. They entered Ogawa under the cover of dusk. The village was eerily quiet. They found their old hut, abandoned but mostly intact. Sumiko, their old neighbor, found them there, her face lighting up with a mixture of shock and joy, quickly followed by fear. "Kira-san, Kenji-kun, by the kami, we thought you lost to the mountains." Or worse, she quickly filled them in. Tanaka Kenji was indeed the new local magistrate, appointed after the previous one had died of a sudden illness. He was, as the merchant had said, ruthless, imposing impossible demands. his every action seemingly designed to curry favor with the domain authorities in Kubota by maximizing tax revenues, regardless of the human cost. Old Ichiro, the headman, had been imprisoned for failing to meet the quotas, and several other villagers had been severely beaten. Kira felt a cold dread mixed with a burning anger. Tanaka, the weakling, had become a petty tyrant, his fear of his superiors transformed into cruelty towards those beneath him. This was the face of the feudal system at its most grotesque, power corrupting not just the strong, but also the weak who were given a taste of it. "We cannot let this stand," Kira said to Kenji, her voice low but resolute. "We did not survive the mountains only to watch our village die under the heel of a man like Tanaka. But what could they do? They were two peasants, returned from presumed death. Open defiance would mean swift retribution." She needed a plan, something as subtle and unexpected as her intervention with Aoki, but with even higher stakes. Her mind raced. Tanaka was driven by fear and ambition. He craved approval from Kubota. What if that craving could be used against him? What if his superiors could be made to see him not as an efficient administrator, but as a source of dangerous instability? A man whose actions might provoke a larger, more troublesome peasant uprising that would draw unwanted attention from Sendai, or even Edo, the Kyoho shogunate, for all its harshness. Valued order above all. A domain seen as mismanaged and prone to rebellion could face severe sanctions. Kira began to observe, to listen. She learned that a high-ranking inspector from Kubota, a senior advisor to Lord Date himself, was due to tour the district in a few weeks to assess the impact of the blight and the effectiveness of local relief measures or lack thereof. This was her chance. She needed to create a situation, a carefully orchestrated incident, that would expose Tanaka's incompetence and cruelty not to the peasants, but to his own superiors. She remembered the lessons from Jirobiai, the tales from the Taihiki. Sometimes, the most effective weapon was not a sword, but information, skillfully deployed. She thought of Haruto, and how he had used her information, framing it for Aoki's ears. She would need to do something similar. Her plan began to take shape. It involved several elements, rallying a small, trusted group of villagers to act in concert. Using Kenji's newfound hunting skills to create a diversion, and crafting a petition, not of overt defiance, but of carefully worded loyal supplication, detailing the village's suffering under Tanaka's administration in a way that implied his actions were counterproductive to the shogun's aims of stability. The petition would need to be discovered by the visiting inspector under circumstances that made Tanaka look both cruel and incapable of maintaining order. The risks were enormous. If they failed, if Tanaka discovered their plan, the consequences would be dire, not just for Kira and Kenji, but for everyone involved. But the alternative, to do nothing, to watch Ogawa slowly strangle, was unbearable. Kira looked at her brother, his young face now set with a grim determination that mirrored her own. She looked at Sumiko, whose fear was now mixed with a desperate, rekindled hope. She thought of her father, of Kenjiro's wisdom, of Jirobiai's parting gift. "The hawk," he had said, "strikes when the moment is right." The moment was approaching. The following weeks were a blur of clandestine activity. Kira, with Kenji as her trusted lieutenant, met secretly with a small group of the most desperate and resilient villagers, Taro, the farmer she had helped save from Aoki. Old Manzo, his spirit unbroken despite his past ordeal. Sumiko, whose network of gossip was surprisingly effective for gathering information. And a few others. They were terrified, but the alternative of slow starvation under Tanaka's heel was a more potent fear. Kira's plan was multi-layered. First, they needed to document Tanaka's abuses, not just the impossible tax demands, but specific instances of cruelty, of confiscated goods that never reached the domain storehouses, of favoritism towards a few sycophantic villagers who acted as his informers. Sumiko and her network were invaluable here. their whispers painting a detailed picture of Tanaka's petty tyrannies. Kira painstakingly recorded these grievances on rough paper, her script small and neat, framing them not as accusations, but as matters of grave concern for the well-being of the shogun's loyal subjects in Ogawa. Second, they needed to ensure the visiting inspector, a man named Lord Okubo, reputed to be stern but fair, and a close confidant of Lord Date, would be receptive to hearing these concerns. This meant creating an atmosphere of barely suppressed crisis, enough to alarm Okubo but not so much as to provoke an immediate, overwhelming crackdown before he arrived. This is where Kenji's skills came in. Under Kira's direction, he and a few other young men began a series of incidents designed to unnerve Tanaka and suggest he was losing control. A small, carefully managed fire in an abandoned shed near the magistrate's office, quickly extinguished, but alarming. A series of anonymous, crudely written messages posted on the village notice board, complaining of hunger and injustice, quickly torn down by Tanaka's guards, but seen by enough people to create a stir. And, most daringly, the theft of a small cache of rice from Tanaka's own guarded storeroom, rice that was then secretly redistributed among the most desperate families. Kenji, using his mountain-honed stealth, accomplished this last feat himself, leaving behind a single hawk feather, Jirobiai's symbolic gift, as a subtle, untraceable calling card of defiance. Tanaka, as Kira had predicted, reacted with escalating panic and brutality. He imposed curfews, ordered more beatings, and made increasingly frantic demands on the starving village, his fear of appearing incompetent making him ever more tyrannical. His reports to Kubota, Kira guessed, would be a mixture of self-justification and downplaying the severity of the situation, lest he be blamed for it. The final piece of Kira's plan was the petition itself. It was not addressed to Tanaka, but directly to Lord Okubo, humbly beseeching his wise intervention. It detailed the village's suffering, praised the shogun's Kyoho reforms in principle, but lamented how their local implementation under Tanaka was leading to despair and potential unrest, which no loyal subject desires. It was a masterpiece of carefully worded deference and subtle accusation. The question was how to get it into Okubo's hands without it being intercepted by Tanaka. Kira decided on a bold, public maneuver. Lord Okubo was scheduled to make a formal inspection of Ogawa, walking through the village to observe conditions firsthand. Kira planned for a group of women, led by Sumiko and herself, to attempt to present the petition directly, feigning a desperate, spontaneous appeal. They would likely be stopped by Tanaka's guards. But the attempt, the public spectacle of desperate peasants being silenced while trying to reach the High Inspector, could be even more damning to Tanaka than the petition itself, especially if Okubo witnessed it. The day Lord Okubo arrived, Ogawa was a village holding its breath. Tanaka, sweating despite the cool autumn air, had ordered the main path swept, the most dilapidated huts hastily patched with fresh straw, and the most emaciated villagers kept out of sight. He greeted Lord Okubo with an excess of bowing and scraping that Kira found nauseating. Okubo was an imposing figure. Older than Aoki had been, his face stern but etched with lines that suggested not cruelty, but a lifetime of difficult decisions. He listened to Tanaka's obsequious report with a non-committal expression, his sharp eyes missing nothing, the fear in the villagers' faces, the overly zealous presence of Tanaka's guards, the subtle signs of hunger that no amount of sweeping could hide. As Okubo began his slow walk through the village, Kira gave the signal. She, Sumiko, and a few other women, their faces pale but resolute, stepped forward from the crowd of onlookers, holding the petition scroll aloft. Lord Okubo-sama, mercy, we beg your compassionate ear, Sumiko cried out, her voice trembling but clear. Tanaka's face contorted in fury and panic. Guards, seize those women, they are disrupting the inspection, disrespectful rabble. The guards moved to intercept them, but Kira and the women stood their ground, continuing their pleas. It was the moment of truth. Lord Okubo raised a hand, his voice calm but carrying undeniable authority. Hold. Let them approach. Tanaka froze, his mouth agape. The guards hesitated. Okubo's gaze was fixed on Kira and the women. He had seen the desperation in their eyes, heard the genuine anguish in their voices. And he had seen Tanaka's panicked, brutal reaction. Kira stepped forward, her heart pounding, and knelt before Lord Okubo, offering the scroll with trembling hands. "My Lord Inspector," she said, her voice low but clear. "We are loyal subjects of the Shogun and Lord Date. We seek only to inform you of the true conditions in our village, lest our suffering bring dishonor to their benevolent rule." Okubo took the scroll, his eyes unreadable. He did not open it immediately. Instead, he looked at Tanaka, whose face was now a sickly green. "Magistrate Tanaka," Okubo said, his voice deceptively mild. "It appears your villagers have concerns. Perhaps your reports to Kubota have not painted the full picture of the challenges faced here." Tanaka stammered, incoherent. The carefully constructed facade of his authority had crumbled. Okubo then turned back to Kira. "Your courage, and that of these women, is noted. I will read this petition. And I will investigate these matters thoroughly. Justice, and the well-being of the Shogun's people are paramount." He then gestured to his own attendants. "Ensure these women are not harmed. They have acted within their rights to petition." The rest of the inspection was a formality. Okubo's demeanor remained stern, but Kira saw a new attentiveness in his eyes as he observed the village, a deeper scrutiny. He asked pointed questions of Tanaka, whose answers became increasingly evasive. Lord Okubo departed Ogawa the next day. He made no pronouncements, offered no immediate solutions. But a few weeks later, word arrived from Kubota. Magistrate Tanaka Kenji had been removed from his post, reassigned to an obscure, insignificant accounting office in a distant part of the domain. A career effectively ended. A new magistrate was appointed to Ogawa, an older, more experienced samurai known for his fairness, if also his strictness. More importantly, a shipment of relief rice, small but significant, arrived from the domain granaries, a direct order from Lord Okubo. It was not a complete victory. The blight's effects would linger. The Kyoho reforms and their tax burdens remained. Feudal Japan had not changed its fundamental nature overnight, but for Ogawa, it was a reprieve, a breath of life. Kira's gamble, born of desperation and a refusal to surrender, had paid off. She had used the system's own emphasis on order and the reputation of its lords against one of its corrupt agents. Kenjiro, when he heard the news, sought out Kira. The old samurai's eyes held a rare gleam of something that might have been pride. "The hawk struck true, Kira," he said, his voice raspy. "You aimed not for the man, but for the shadow he cast on his master's honor. That is a lesson many samurai never learn." Kira felt no elation, only a profound weariness, and a quiet sense of rightness. She had not sought power or glory, only a measure of justice for her village, a chance for her people to survive. She had walked a dangerous path, and for now, she had navigated it successfully. Looking out at the Akita landscape, now touched by the first fragile hints of a new spring, Kira knew that the struggle was never truly over. The great currents of history, the rise and fall of powers, the evolution of the samurai class and the feudal system they upheld, would continue their relentless flow. But she also knew that even the smallest voice, speaking truth to power, even the most humble life, lived with courage and integrity, could create a ripple, a change in the current. And sometimes, that was enough to keep the flame of hope burning, a small, steady light against the vast darkness. Her journey, which had begun in grief and anger, had led her through fear and desperation to a quiet strength, a deep understanding of the intricate, often cruel, but sometimes surprisingly malleable, nature of the world she inhabited. The impermanence of Tanaka's tyranny was a testament to that, and the resilience of Ogawa, her village, was a testament to the enduring human spirit.